Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I hope you all had a pleasant lunch. Without further ado, let's open the second session for today. The second session will be led by Christopher Kaysen, a visiting lecturer at the Faculty of Law, Islamic University of Indonesia, who received his JD at the University of Seattle. Time and place is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I've been practicing that for years now. Annyeonghaseyo and selamat siang. And konnichiwa. So, thank you all for coming. Thank you. I hope you had an enjoyable lunch. I won't talk very much. This is actually a special conference for me, having spent a good portion of the last 10 years of my life in both Korea and Indonesia. So to bring the two together is quite amazing for me to have this experience. But move right along to the speaker so that they have plenty of time. You'll get tired of listening to me otherwise. So we'll have, for the second session, Isoku will be professor of international law at UII University and also the co-editor-in-chief of the Asian Yearbook. And very closely with him. If you please come up. And Professor Sim Sang-min. He's a professor, assistant professor of international law at the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. Professor Park Hyun-kyung, also an adjunct professor at Kyunhee University Law School, and Tae-gil. We've heard. Sorry for mispronouncing your name really wrong. So this is Institute of Legal Studies. He'll be jointly presenting today. So we'll begin. Professor, please proceed. Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, it's my pleasure to be back to Georgia to present a paper here. Although I'm going to talk about the peace treaty in general terms, since due to the time constraint I have, I'm going to talk about very specifically about one of the peace treaties I personally very much research on, which is the San Francisco Peace Treaty. The territorial settlement in peace treaty, which is the topic I'm going to present, and again, good afternoon. And the territorial settlement in treaties, which is the topic I'm going to talk today, and basically I'm much involved on the one of the specific the peace treaties, which is the peace treaty of Japan of the 1951. If we look at the map here, this is the based on the one of the drafts they came from the San Francisco Peace Treaty, and how the things I want to convey in my presentation is that how the political implication involved the drop in history, and how that the discussions produce the outcome and the still left a legacy in these contemporary times. Like in many countries, like Indonesia, Indonesia is one of the top states in terms of the role of ocean policy, since it has many neighbors. Like Indonesia, Korea has with Japan and with China and with North Korea, we have many sovereignty issues or delimitation issues, and also fishing activities and law enforcement and preservation of marine environment. Actually, that 4 topics is basically the topics derived from the South China Sea arbitration. In the previous session, the lawyer raised the issue about the Chinese non-participation in the arbitration. And then there are many discussions we had, the kinds of implications of the South China Sea, the arbitral award in terms of the East Asia. But having said that, the one specific issues I'm going to talk in this forum is that on the small island between the Korea and Japan, we call the Dokdo. Maybe Kanami more familiar with the Takeshima. Jurisdiction, the map of which was used in Korea and used in Japan. Because although we have the bilateral issues, but it has the multilateral issues because China is involved as a third party. So if you look at the map used in Korea, as you see that the intermediate zones go inside of the Chinese-Japan's intermediate zone here, if you look at the map here. But if you look at the Japanese version, it stopped before the Japan and Chinese intermediate provisional measure zone, which means that the interpretation and application of the treaty, same agreement is different in Japan and in Korea, because both states use the different map with the same text of the agreement. But how this one came from? Because if you look at it very closely about the one of the articles of the San Francisco Peace Treaty, which is Article 2. Article 2A is a treaty is about the territorial disposition of the defeated nations of Japan. They say that Japan recognizing independence of Korea and renounce all right, title, and claim to Korea, including island Pol Pot and Port Hamilton and Dazulet. Pol Pot is Jeju-do, you mean in the southern parts of the island of Korea, and Port Hamilton is Gyeongdo, and Dazulet is Ulleungdo, the big island next to the Dokdo. So the final version, the problem of the San Francisco Peace Treaty is that the final draft, the final version of the treaty do not mention about island Korea with disputed with Japan. So as I show that the map here, this is the treaty version of the San Francisco Peace Treaty. As you see that the issues of Dokdo was inside of the Korean jurisdiction, based on the treaty of the San Francisco Peace Treaty. But it directly quite coincident with the current maritime jurisdiction in Northeast Asia. If we compare the map with the San Francisco Peace in 1951 and current maritime jurisdiction in Northeast Asia, that has the significant implications to the current map we use until today. So I personally, when I'm working on the final conclusion of the treaty, we, as many treaty work did, we have a various versions of the drafts. I found the 19 drafts so far, and if you see that how the allowed power at the time to dispose this destiny of the island. The first time they go to this island to Japan and Korea, and since there is something inside, they decide not to mention in the peace treaty. So still there is a debate, what is the implication of this interpretation of the territorial disposition of the Dokdo in terms inside of the San Francisco Peace Treaty. This is the first map used by the a lot of power, in particular U.S. State Department. If you look at the Ireland, the doctor here is inside of the territorial jurisdiction of Korea, and then there is a many drafts to come up. If you go to the National Archive of the United States, you can find very interesting documents which show that if you have some of the issues come up, how you interpret the treaty, you have to interpret the treaty the various means what we learn from the very textbook of the treaty law. And for example, the first draft that gives us the guideline is that Japan will also be expelled from all of the territories which has taken by violence and greed. And opposite the three great powers. This is the Potsdam Agreement. They say that the Korea in due course shall be free and independent. And the term is quite interesting. Is that I know the previous one is a Cairo Declaration, and the Potsdam Declaration also repeats that what Cairo Declaration say, and the Japanese sovereignty shall be limited to island Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, and Shikoku, and such minor island as we determine. And the previous Cairo the declaration, they say that the territory is taken by the greed and violence. And also the term used here is that minor island as we determine is a very subjective term. So it can be subject to the various interpretation. So that there are up and down because, if the history do not clearly mention about where this specific island should go, that is naturally, we can easily imagine that is a subject of the debate between the claimants at the later stage. So that the communist countries, the most important one is the United Kingdom, proposed that they circulated the memorandum in terms of territorial disposition to say it is recommended that the main territorial article in the treaty should confine Japan's sovereignty to Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, and Shikoku, with the addition of the minor island to be determined at the peace conference. So the United Kingdom suggestion is that if the allotted power cannot able to decide where this island should go, they propose that it should be decided by the peace conference. It's 1951, but it was rebutted by the United States at the time because they say that it will be for the peace conference to decide which of the minor islands shall remain under Japanese sovereignty. And when this decision has been received as the main territorial article, could be something quite as simple as recommended above. And they say that in determining which of the minor islands shall remain under Japanese sovereignty, the desired consideration must be strategic. So the political implications involved in the other issues come up is that at the time you think about 1950, that Cold War just began in the East Asia, and the reference made by the Professor Reichauer to say that stressing the proper size classical approach to Japanese. I always treat my dear colleague, Japanese colleague at Ghana very carefully because all the documents I found at the National Archive say that proper psychological approach to Japanese is needed. So that the one is come up with that recommendation, the recommend reconsideration of the Takeshima Isato issues, and they say that the security consideration might conceivably envisage whether and later stages they are. So when we decided easily where the island should go at the peace conference or the afterward, it is quite sensible to think about which country has more historical rights or historical title of this specific territory. But at the peace conference or in the deciding inside of the drafting bureau of the State Department, they never seriously think about which country has a historical title of the features. All the documents say that they have to approach the issues whether in later station or the strategic approach. and that made by the William Seabolt at the time the political advisor United States in Japan. And there are a couple of the more issues come up. It's like this is the memorandum written by the Douglas Megan at the time. He said that it's like that. We believe they should govern the effort of the United States in bringing about the Japanese peace settlements, and at the time they have to think about they deal with the Orientals, which has the very critical the political complexities involved. And the other issues come up is all the time they have to remind that they are dealing with the Orientals from whom proper psychological approach, manner of procedure of the cardinal importance. So it is quite interesting. Every document we notice, we found at the National Archive in terms of San Francisco Peace Treaty, in terms of territorial disposition. Not many documents talking about which country has a historical title or historical evidence of a specific element. And many documents say that about the political, the security consideration of the features. So like the United Kingdom, the Commonwealth countries suggest that if we do not decide the future of this territory, it is because of tensions between two claimants afterward. So that they suggest that you draw the line, as you see that the map, so that to avoid any misunderstanding what is the implication of this territorial discussion afterward. But it was also rejected by the United States because the United States strongly argued that if they draw the line, make a fence to the Japan's territory, it gives us the psychological disadvantage for the Japanese colleagues. So there are many documents that come up here. So I do not repeat every document I found here, but the main message I want to convey here in my presentation in terms of territorial disposition of San Francisco Peace Treaty is that the drafter, the United States, never seriously give their consideration what is the historical title when they decide the future of the territory, which is one of the tensions as I showed at the map or the diagram between two countries. That is still serious debates between countries. Now, I do not say that where decided should go, but what I want to say is that when a lot of power to decide the future of the territory, they have to give more consideration of the historical, the background of the features. But documents show there's nothing much about that. So, as I mentioned, finally, as the final close of the San Francisco Peace Treaty, as you saw that there is no mention about the Dokdo or Takeshima or the Ryango Rock in Western Tim, because the final recommendation by the United States is that territories to be taken from Japan did not be mentioned in peace treaty. As I mentioned at the time, it's the 1950s, just Korean War is broken out and the Cold War began. The United States is the most important concern in East Asia's policies that the rebuild of the Japan as early as possible, so that they want quickly done, quickly they conclude the peace treaty with Japan as early as possible. So everything goes very quickly because there is no need to mention about the territories to be taken from Japan. So that despite the many criticism inside of the State Department, like I found this item is something surprising to say that territories to be taken from Japan did not be mentioned in the peace treaty. This is not circulated word even inside of the State Department. So that is the what we have here, and after the San Francisco Peace Treaty was done, there are many documents to say that very limited member of the State Department to deal with this peace treaties, the territorial disposition. Not every department to touch upon this issue. So there is another document say that the draft treaty has not been widely circulated inside of the State Department. So how we interpret the documents when we approach the interpretation of the territorial closed disposition of San Francisco Peace Treaty. The peace treaty is a very political treaty. A lot of power has a widely can exercise disposition power to take in technically every territory they want to take it from the defeated nation. But that was done in an early stage. But I do not know that what it can be done after 1945, actually after World War II. So that this is currently what exactly we have here in East Asia, in particular the bilateral relations between the Korea and Japan. So that my message, I want to see that in combining with general understanding international territorial disputes. I think the previous session, the speakers mentioned about a couple of the cases decided by the Court of International Court of Justice. In particular, my favorite paragraph is the 202, the government Nigeria cases. This is unfortunately, it's a separate opinion by Judge Langeva to say the inequality of denial rights inherent in colonial practice in relation to colonies is currently recognized as elementary true. And there is a resultant duty to memorialize these injustices and at the same time to acknowledge the historical facts. You may a little bit confuse what my message I want to convey in terms of territorial disposition of San Francisco Peace Treaty, how this this separate opinion link together. Because from the Japanese point of view, maybe this territory is a Japanese one. It does not necessarily mean that it linked with the historical injustice and whatever the colonial practice. But at the same time, from the perspective of Korea, it directly linked with the colonial practice. So there are huge differences in terms of the interpretation of the peace treaty. But my message is that if I have to say that if the State Department or as a main drafter of the San Francisco Peace Treaty give their due consideration of the historical facts at the time what claimant to propose. And outcome may be the same or may be different. I'm not saying that the outcome, but what I want to say is the drafting history. As I mentioned that the San Francisco Peace Treaty is a highly political treaty, that technically it can be done on whatever the victors want to do. However, I'm not quite sure whether it can be done after a post-World War period, in particular 1952 of the San Francisco Peace Treaty's territorial disposition in East Asia. So we think about, we talk today to talk about the historical injustice, and I like the term of the historical criticism when you see that when you approach the various facts of the international law. So I think the very nature of our DILA meeting is that they propose the more fair the view of international law. So I think I can just stop here.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lee. As the representative of the West, it's very interesting to hear kind of how the criticisms of the West imposing its values and how it's divided up, especially in territorial disputes such as this. I will say, I think we did a better job in Korea than we did in India and Pakistan, at least. But I understand, I definitely understand the point of view. So, by the way, I forgot to mention at the beginning, I think each presenter will have about 20 minutes to divide up the hour by 3. You're well under time, but please keep that in mind. And are you ready to go? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's my honor and privilege to be able to present my ideas here. I said ideas, not an article, because it's still a work in progress. So I deeply appreciate your feedback and your questions as I move forward with presenting my ideas. The topic that I'm going to address today is the North-South divide sustainable development and how this is related to what is happening in the Asian context that deals with the problem with the sustainable development in ASEANs. Well, historically, the concept of sustainable development grew out of the concern that there must be some kind of a core principle to promote development that will, on one hand, preserve the future needs of the future generations, while at the same time proceed with the best available opportunities for economic development. So this concept historically was a method to guarantee intergenerational equity in pursuing economic development. But the discourse somewhat changed when it came to discussing how do we go about sharing burdens in terms of the sustainable development. And there, the clear differentiation between different groups of nations have appeared. In one sense, developed nations say that they are historically responsible for the current events of environmental degradation because they were the first ones who have polluted their environment and put in the pollutants. So that what is happening in the contemporary world is partially their fault. And the developing countries basically saying that yes, we are not historically responsible for the environmental degradation, because you developed countries started polluting the environment at the first beginning. And it does not really matter that we are currently polluting more, damaging the environment and much more serious ways. So the discourse changed into how we go about sharing burdens, and the concept of sustainable development was understood differently depending on which group of countries you belong to. And even some countries went out to propose that these developing country bloc wouldn't follow through with the sustainable development unless the help comes from the countries bloc in terms of technological transfer and also the capacity building. And this concept was quite evident when we talked about the capacity building in the context of the Laos, especially the group of 77 in China proposed in one statement that the technological transfer in the context of marine science is the key key element of the North-South cooperation in marine protection of marine environment and then also the ocean governance. So the question that I want to raise here is it really wise to make sustainable development a hostage of the discussion of the burden sharing, especially when it comes to making the pursuing sustainable development conditional on the assistance, technical and financial assistance from the developed countries. I slightly am in position to say that it's not going to be a well-thought strategy to develop each developing country's economies in a way that will both guarantee the sustained economic prosperity while also protecting the environment in many different areas. So I think that it is quite necessary for us to divide the concept of sustainability and the concept of development, depending on which country you are focusing on. And from the developing countries' point, it will be more beneficial to be focused on the development aspect rather than the sustainability aspect, at least in the first early stage of development. To back up that argument, I borrow from the other scholarly discipline, which is economics. And a lot of kind of scholars talk about the hypothesis on the environmental Kuznets curve. Well, economically, Kuznets curve refers to the positive connotation between the economic prosperity and the equality of income distribution. What it means is that as the economy grows economically, they tend to they tend to experience the phase where the income distribution gets worse. But when the economy reaches a certain point, and after that, the income distribution gets to be more equal than compared to their early stages of development. And the economist says that we can try and see if there is such a relationship exists between the economic development and the environmental protection. And some economists say that we have found some evidence, even though it's a little bit subject to arguments, that as some economists move forward with their economic development, the level of their environmental protection seems to be getting better. And so they reach a certain stage of economic development. And some economists say that, well, that those empirical evidence is mixed at best, because they are subject to different interpretations. But as I see around here, especially in the Asian context, we can see some positive relationship between the economic development and the sustainable and the environmental protection, especially when it comes to what is happening in and around China. But we believe that China has been so focused on the economic development only at the expense of the economic, at the expense of the environmental protection. So they are not fully concerned about the environmental protection. The thing is that this now change. China is getting more focused on environmental protection with the introduction of special legislation focused on environmental protection. For example, from 2016, they introduced a new legislation on environmental protection on Taxation Act. And what it says is that that law will be a basis for dividing up the burdens for many polluters to pay for the cost that they are incurring to the society. So they are going to be incur some discharges based on the volume of the pollutants they put into the waters, to the land, and even to the ocean. So that is a positive development that we can see from the China's territory, and we can refer to that as a starting point that the Chinese people are getting more serious about the balance between environmental protection and development. And this is also something that we can find out in a broader context, which is the protection of the climate. China usually was called to be the biggest polluter in climate. They are currently ranked as the #1 emitter of greenhouse gases. But at the same time, they are taking more positive measures to cut down on their greenhouse gas emissions. And they even propose to help the other developing nations from taking more climate-friendly technologies through financial aid and technological transfer. So what we call as a South-South cooperation is becoming more possible and becoming more visible. So I think that what is happening, what is taking place in the context of the Chinese youth orientation in terms of economic development and sustainability is something that we need to focus, so that we will have a better, we will have a more practical approach to balancing economic development and development. And I haven't touched upon the issue of what Korea can do to promote the idea of the sustainable development in cooperation with other nations. Probably that is something that I need to focus on when to develop my ideas to put into a real academic article. But I would conclude my argument by saying that at least we are seeing some emergence of new approach to the sustainable development. Not based upon the economy to developing countries, but based on cooperative principles that will try to balance the sustainability and the economic prosperity. The countries as they move forward.
Very interesting too. Thank you again for your presentation. It'd be very interesting to see how your research develops too. How the final product and the genesis of it turns out. It was interesting because from Seattle, my hometown is famous for the WTO riots that we had. And, I remember seeing environmentalists and labor unions walking together. Normally they're on opposite sides of things, but they both had the WTO in their sights at the same time. Okay. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting us. And Professor Park and I prepared together for this speech. Professor Park and I will deliver the speech about international economic law, especially on the fairness within the WTO regime. And we draw a conclusion, firstly, that Asian countries need to prepare to make the current regime better. And we can do that in terms of international economic law. And secondly, Asian countries, whether they are developed or developing or less developed, need to active participation in rule-making process, particularly bilateral or multilateral agreements to eliminate, disguise the protectionism in international society, and then the realization of the fair trade will come closer. A trigger of this presentation is the question, the current international trade regime is fair or not? We would like to answer not fair yet, but the regime has been slowly changing and the time is closer to make the current regime better international economic and trade rules. We easily witness conflicts between developed countries and developing countries in terms of international economic order. And we saw, Professor Park and me, so one reason of the conflict is current unfairness of trade. After the Second World War, the international society made a VAT be introduced as a legal regime to realize free trade. And the introduction of WTO regime in 1994 has been propelling the fair trade as well as free trade. Even though the spirit of fair trade in WTO is still having a hard time to solve the increasing number of conflicts between developing countries and developed countries about the concept of fairness. This makes me and Professor Park raise the question, is this because the fair trade may not be fair or justice? In fact, developing countries and developed countries have argued level playing field to implement a fair trade, but we see some conceptual differences about level playing field between the two sides. By and large, the developed group see that no interference by a government is the most important element for the level playing field. Meanwhile, the developing group and the less developed group see that we should recognize the economic power and correct of imbalance of international payments. And these views resulted in different approaches to the special and differential treatment, so-called SNDT. which is embodied in the WTO rules. But the lack of specific standards have led serious conflicts between North and South. And to narrow down conceptual separation and find the touch points, the WTO launches DDA negotiation, but only to result in utter failure. Due to the failure, abundance of bilateral agreements such as FTAs come to be an international trend, and currently, mega FTAs such as TPP or CEPA seems like an important issue in Asian countries. And the next step may be integration of those FTAs and mega FTAs as a common and general agreement. We think that Asia needs to prepare the next step together. Most Asian countries experience colonial rules in the modern international law era, and the legacy of the era still seems to influence on Asia. And they have a common interest to make a substantial fairness in international economic law, as well as to overcome the economic influence of the Western side. And we can do that. Asia includes countries that have any influence with international trade order. China, Japan, Korea, Australia, India, and Indonesia are such countries. In Asia, developing and less developed countries are living peaceful coexistence. For this, as a short-term goal, we need active participation to rule-making process, especially through bilateral agreements or other separate agreements to eliminate disguised protectionism. And as a long-term goal, we need to find elements of fairness concept which Asian countries have pursued in a common sense. This is all our presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Kim. That's a part. So we have lots of time for, thank you for your brevity in your presentations. So we have lots of time for questions and discussion. Does anybody have questions for someone or all of our panel? Yes,
Thank you. I'd like to raise a question to the last presenters. You mentioned about the special and differential treatment in the WTO. As far as I'm aware, that the implementation and enforcement of special and differential treatment of the WTO have not so effective, have not been so effective, because special and differential treatment, because they are good for developing countries, but to implement the provisions, there are a lot of requirements, and also some procedures have to be passed by the countries. So, how is the new development, recent development of special and differential treatment in terms of the effectiveness? Because some of the special and differential treatment, I think, have already what we call it, expired. Okay. The traditional period, so many agreements have expired. Could you please tell
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. One question for Dr. Shinzaki. I really enjoyed your presentation. I learned a lot. Thank you very much. You talk about sustainable development, sustainability, and it reminds me the previous session, the morning sessions, when Professor Kim Sung-won talked about the Italian and its direction related to the development of international work. So do you think we can you elaborate a little bit more? Maybe there's some link on the Italian spirit or some concept that can be intertwined or linked to the sustainability or sustainable development that can be seen in the development of the environment law. That's a question to you. And also a question to Mr. Kim Tae-gil and Professor Hwang Kyung. You talk about some of the fair trade, fairness. It also reminds me the previous presentation by Professor Oh Seung-jin on justice, and also he shared some issues on unfair treaty, unequal treaty. So could you think there can be certain link or interaction with what you point out, the fairness to the development of international law, unfair treaties in the history, injustice, historical injustice in East Asia, or also I don't know if this is a relevant question, but recently there are many discourse on the tariff war issues, mainly led by U.S. With President Trump. So, do you have any idea on that? Fairness too, related to that issue. Thank you.
Thank you. I was hoping we would get through the day without hearing President Trump, but I guess that's unavoidable. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. All three of you very thank you did very interesting presentations. And I have two questions to Professor Lee Seo-gu. The first one is in regard to the question on San Francisco Treaty. Do you consider that the 1951 San Francisco Treaty was just and proper in comparison with other peace treaties concluded after World War II? As mentioned by Professor Christopher Kaysen, he just said that America did better job than India and Pakistan. I was just wondering if you had.
Do you see any?
I was just wondering how did, in comparison with other treaties after World War II, do you consider San Francisco Peace Treaty was a better or worse peace treaty? Second question is more concerned with the inherent nature of peace treaty. Do you consider that it is possible to discuss fairness and justice in peace treaty? Because you know that the winner's voice dominates in the peace treaty. What is your view on the winner's justice aspect of peace treaty? Thank you.
Can you go ahead?
Thank you very much for the time. I would like to ask a question to Assistant Professor Sang Min Sim. So you talk about the not certified on sustainable development and the recent development in the ASEAN context. I'm so interested with your presentation that when we discuss about the sustainable development principle and how the implementation in the national level, and especially I would like to know in Korea, how about the government policy to interpret the sustainable development principle? Because when we talk about this principle, we recognize there are three pillars of sustainable development, about economic development, environmental protection, and also social development. Among the three pillars, in some countries, especially in developing countries, that there is no balance here. That economic development has always become the priority, and the environmental protection usually that is ignoring by the government. So how about in Korea? Is that any balance about the economic development, and other hand also they protect about the environment, and how about the public participation as the form to get involved the public to support the policy of the government. I mean, there is certain kind of program that can be some kind of model that we can, in Indonesia, for example, to learn from your experience in your state. Thank you very much.
Okay, are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you. I have one question to the Professor Lee. Your presentation is concerned about the interpretation of peace treaty in terms of the injustice or something like that. I think that you fully know about that there are some the rules concerning the interpretation of the treaty, especially in the VCLTP and the Convention on Law of the Treaties. Article 31 is the general rules of the interpretation, and Article 32 is the supplementary means of the interpretation. I fully agree with you that it is necessary for Asian countries to argue that some other kinds of the mechanism for the interpretation is needed, such as the historical interpretation of the peace treaty or something like that. But I think that this kind of the argument is acceptable by the international judicial bodies or something like that. And so that I focus on the specific provisions of the Article 31 of the VCLT, so that any instrument which are made by the one or other more parties in connection with the conclusion of the treaty and accepted by the other parties as an international related to the treaty, and another provisions deals with any subsequent agreement, whether any customs or something like that. So if we argue that there is a strong necessity of the incorporated the historical interpretation of the treaty, that must be supported by the state practice in the real cases. So would you include the source that there is some strong support to the state practice to provide by the historical interpretation in the history?
Okay, are there any other questions? So, if you're ready to proceed, we have two different questions related to the WTO environmental. So, if you don't mind, go ahead and answer, I guess, the first and the third question.
Thank you, Professor Nandan, for your question. We agree with your saying, especially the less effectiveness of SNDT and the too many requirements and the procedure hardness of developing countries. But we think we cannot and we should not forget the concept of SNDT. And it is very important to it is very important concept, and we think that the failure of a DDA negotiation shows the power of the developing countries. And in terms of our requirements, Asia has been exchanging its culture for a long time, and so we can draw some common elements from the FTAs or multilateral agreements between Asian countries, and multilateralism in international economic regime can. In the multilateralism, the developing countries' role can be more emphasized and should be emphasized. And, to Professor Beck, Professor O and the Dr. Sim, the opinion is the same line with our presentation, and the initiative got reflects the the proposal of developed countries, which the developed countries, the proposal of the developed country have seen that overpowering the developing or underdeveloped countries, and so. This is our answer. Answer.
I think that was a complete answer, so that's fantastic. And if you would be so kind, Dr. Steve, two questions on sustainability and one on implementation on a national level.
Well, thank you very much for those two thought-provoking questions, and it really helped me clarify my ideas as I will go forward developing this conceptual reorientation of sustainable development. Well, a short answer to your first question, Professor Ben, whether I would go for the following the line of the Eastphalia argument, which is in the context of reformulating some of the legal principles in the East Asian context. That is clearly no. But I would at least try to sever the association of the concept of sustainability of the technical and financial assistance as a necessary condition for the pursuit of sustainability by the developing nations as well. And I think essentially I'm echoing Professor Wang and Professor Kim's argument that the trade system would have to be more focused on expanding towards strengthening the capacity of the developing countries to grow their economies with the help of the developed nations. I mean, by cutting off the relations between the sustainability and the economic development and the reprioritization of the economic development at least in terms of its implementation for sustainability. I don't necessarily argue that developed countries can sit back and sit on their hands without doing anything. I would rather argue that those developed countries should do more to help the economies of developing nations by giving more preparation treatments to the export items of the developing countries, so that they will actually have expanded their developmental capacity to be economically more developing, and if that development continues and proceeds at speed enough to be also focused on the sustainability of their development. That's when I think that we can strike a balance between the sustainability of economic development, also the prosperity of each economically disadvantaged countries, that they will pursue the real progress in terms of social, economic, and environmental context. That actually goes back to the Professor question, whether Puccini's question, which was about whether we have kind of balance between the implementation of environmental policy in terms of economic development, sustainability, and also the social progress. It's subject to so many different answers depending on who you ask. But my understanding of the implementation of some of the Korean environmental policies is yes, we are trying to strike a balance between these three policy objectives. For example, we've been trying to implement the climate policy based on our nationally determined contribution, which basically says that we are going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions compared to our business as usual emission levels by 2030 by 37%. We actually reformulated our domestic environmental policy, especially in terms of the energy sector. And we decided that when I say we as a government, the Korean government decided to implement a new policy, which is basically termed the energy switch, which is a shift from fossil fuel based generation to climate friendly generation. So we will cut down on our generations from coal and other fossil fuel based level, but we'll also try to be helpful with the socially disadvantaged groups by giving them some energy vouchers in case they are too poor to pay for the increased electricity bills. And all the electricity policy gets implemented as the government envisions. So we are trying to strike a balance between the social policy goals and the policy goals and also the policy goals. We'll be going deeper into how those policies get made and who are the interest groups that takes the upper hand over some other legislative policies. That is subject to different topics and different discussions. So I probably have to stop at that, but I will welcome your further questions after the session.
Professor Lee, two questions.
Yeah.
Somewhat related.
Right. In Korea, we make a note who is main occasion, not the what is content occasion. Thank you very much, speakers. Actually, as Chris mentioned, the occasions intertwine each other. As far as I understand that, I agree with Junior O's comments. In the very nature of the peace treaty, I believe it's the same. I think that even if you look at the practice of the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty, I do not quite notice that when the victors take a very serious consideration of the historical background of the disputed area when they dispose of their territory. So that my understanding is how the state practice or the subsequent agreement, as Professor Lee mentioned, and based on the Article 31 Vienna Convention to follow, I do not see that there are any changes at all. So that my argument is that we are a very long way to go to see that when the victors decide or dispose of territory of the defeated nation, they have to take very serious consideration of the historical background of the issues. But in my presentation, what is my argument is that even if the peace treaty made the territorial disposition in that framework, if the case goes to the third party the settlement mechanism as Professor Olsen presented in his presentation about the settlements, he used a term of the global justice, which is a very subject term, as I raised that. But my argument is that if you see that I state the judgment, due to time constraint, I do not the mentions it very clearly. But if you look at, for example, the Bahrain case, in terms of how the interpreter decide the destiny of the Hawara Island, they only refer the one single evidence, which is the British decisions of 1939, when the British political advisor in the area to believe that that island belonged to. They do not give their due consideration when they decide the future of that dispute to the island. And the same things we can notice that the Qatar, after Qatar Bahrain is the and Nigeria case, and I believe the other cases to follow. So my argument is that if we know that the peace treaty is a highly critical nature And we know that victors do not give their consideration when they dispose of territory. My argument is that the courts have to disregard the decision of the victors in the peace treaty. So my argument is that the decision-making process and outcome of the peace treaty cannot be a consideration when courts decide the future of the territory when they review in the case. So my arguments in terms of the discussion, in terms of the evidence evaluation, the judgment is that since the drafting history or the decision-making process is highly political, the political should be depoliticized when courts approach the issue. That's my argument.
Okay, I think we are only 20 minutes behind schedule, which is a record for a conference of this nature. Thank you to our panel members. It's obviously another fascinating presentation. I hope these conversations continue into the social time as well. And so on that note, thank you again for the opportunity to be chairman of the session. I'm truly honored to be here among so many great scholars. Just to add my own from the English speaker, native English speaker, remember fairness and justice have two far different meanings in these contexts. So thank you very much, and I believe I'll turn the floor back over to our MC. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. That concludes our session for now. We proceed to a short coffee break for 20 minutes, and we'll see you back in 20 minutes in this room again. Thank you. We have an announcement from the head of the meeting.
This is a good news for the participants, actually. Okay. This one. So, where is it?
Good news come usually late.
Yes. Yeah. So this is a good news for the participants. The first announcement is about that you can also send the link of the YouTube streaming because our conference today is 24 hours streaming. So anybody's coming from all around the world can watch our conference. So,
are you serious?
yes. So you can also access through HTTPS, YouTube, job, I don't know how to say it. So you can also write down there, or in easy things, you can also subscribe the channel of our YouTube because we have our campus have special YouTube channel. So you can also search UII Yogyakarta. Once you subscribe, and you will find out the live streaming of this conference today. And also, another announcement is about the certificate will be ready tomorrow. So I would like to ask the participant to check your name in the list, maybe in the receptionist table. So please check your name. If there is a mistaken or maybe something wrong with your name, just put it with the handwriting there. And also the last one. So on Monday we will have Borobudur trip. So we will visit two temples. The first temple is the oldest Buddhist temple in the world. It's around like 1.5 hours from this city, from this hotel. And since for foreigner there are specific charge for the ticket, so we would like to make sure that each participant should provide the ticket price for around like 300,000 rupiah. And please, Mr. Yaris will collect the money, and we will also buy the ticket online. So this
Is it good news?
Yeah, good we will have a trip there. So, and also the free one that the rector would like to give us a present because we can have a free ticket entrance to our university Buddhist temple, the Ganesha temple. So in our university we have museum and it's all free for all the participants. So we have good and bad news as well. So thank you very much and enjoy your coffee break.
Thank you.